The crowd at Riverdale Park fell silent as Scott Harrington's hand shot up. His prized German shepherd, Max, sat motionless at his side, muscles coiled like springs beneath his glossy black and tan coat. This was their moment, the demonstration of perfect obedience that had made them legends in the K-9 unit. "Stay," Scott commanded, his voice carrying across the gathered families. That's when Max's ears suddenly pricked forward. His amber eyes locked onto something across the lawn, a tall man cradling what appeared to be a sleeping child. A low growl rumbled in Max's throat. "Max, stay," Scott repeated, firmer this time, for the first time in 5 years of flawless service. Max did the unthinkable. He lunged forward, snapping his leash taut, then breaking free with explosive force. "Max, no!" Scott bellowed. But Max was already charging through the crowd, fangs bared, moving with terrible purpose toward the man and child. Parents snatched their kids away, screaming. In 27 years of K-9 training, Scott had never witnessed such defiance. Something primitive in Max had awakened something stronger than years of discipline. What Max sensed, no human could. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. Augusta, Georgia's Riverdale Park, spread out like a patchwork quilt beneath the warm September sun. Oak trees cast dappled shadows across the sprawling green lawns where families gathered for the annual Fall Family Day. Children darted between carnival booths while the scent of kettle corn and barbecue hung in the air. It was the kind of perfect autumn day that made folks forget their troubles, at least for a while. In a roped-off section near the park's center, 53-year-old Scott Harrington stood tall, despite the slight stoop in his shoulders, a remnant from his Army days. His weathered face, creased by sun and hardship, still commanded respect. 20 years in the military, followed by 8 as a police K-9 trainer, had left their mark, visible in the slight limp when he walked and the distant look that sometimes clouded his blue eyes. Folks in Augusta knew Scott as a man of few words, but iron discipline. At Scott's side stood Max, a magnificent German shepherd with unusual amber eyes. Unlike his handler's rigid posture, Max seemed to vibrate with barely contained energy. The bond between them was immediately apparent to anyone watching, a connection forged through 5 years of shared life since Scott had found the abandoned puppy cowering in a drainage ditch during a thunderstorm. "That dog's got a sixth sense," Chief Morgan often remarked. At 60, Police Chief William Morgan had been Scott's friend since their high school football days. With retirement looming, the chief had a soft spot for the K-9 unit Scott had built from scratch. Across the park, 7-year-old Ellie Barnes had been enjoying the face-painting booth just an hour earlier. With delicate features and wispy blonde hair, Ellie rarely spoke above a whisper due to her mild autism. Animals, however, brought out a different side of her, especially dogs. Her mother Sarah's recent struggle with pills after her husband's combat death had left Ellie increasingly withdrawn. Robert Dawson, Ellie's maternal uncle, stood at the edge of the crowd at 42. His resemblance to his sister Sarah was striking, though his expression carried a determined edge as he watched the child from a distance. Recently returned to Augusta after years away, few recognized the former high school quarterback who'd once been the town's golden boy. None could have predicted how their lives would violently intersect in the next few moments, forever changing the peaceful community of Augusta. Ladies and gentlemen, what you're about to see today is the result of over 2,000 hours of specialized training. Scott's voice carried across the gathering crowd as he stood in the demonstration area, Max sitting attentively at his side. Max here is one of only 8 K-9 officers in the state certified in both suspect apprehension and narcotics detection. The audience, mostly families with young children eager to see the police dog in action, pressed closer to the yellow tape marking the demonstration area. Chief Morgan stood off to the side, arms crossed over his barrel chest, a proud smile creasing his face. Max understands over 40 verbal commands and 15 hand signals. Scott continued, his tone carrying the confidence of a man who'd found his calling. More importantly, he understands his duty. As Scott spoke, his mind drifted briefly to the day he'd found Max, a scrawny 3-month-old puppy, huddled in a drainage pipe during a summer storm. The veterinarian hadn't given the malnourished pup good odds, but Scott recognized something in those unusual amber eyes, an intelligence and determination that mirrored his own. After I retired from the Army, I was pretty lost. Scott had confessed to Chief Morgan over whiskey one night. Training Max gave me purpose again. He never elaborated on the nightmares that still woke him, sweat-soaked and gasping, or how the dog's steady presence kept the worst of his PTSD at bay. Scott signaled to Officer Jenkins, who stepped forward wearing a heavily padded suit. Max will now demonstrate proper suspect apprehension. Notice how he responds only to specific commands and releases immediately upon order. The demonstration proceeded perfectly. Max held position until Scott's command sent him flying across the grass to take down Jenkins. The shepherd's power was impressive, 100 pounds of muscle and discipline, but it was his control that made the crowd gasp. The instant Scott called release, Max backed away, returning to heel position. "Good boy," Scott murmured, scratching behind Max's ear. The dog maintained his professional demeanor, but his tail gave a single satisfied wag across the park. Robert Dawson worked his way slowly through the crowd. His gaze kept returning to a small blonde girl at the face-painting booth, Ellie sitting patiently as a volunteer painted a butterfly on her cheek. Sarah was nowhere to be seen, having disappeared toward the parking lot 20 minutes earlier with a man Robert didn't recognize. Robert's jaw tightened. 2 weeks of watching his niece from a distance had confirmed his worst fears. His sister's addiction had spiraled since her husband's death, leaving Ellie increasingly neglected. Yesterday, he'd made his decision after driving past their house at midnight to find Ellie alone on the porch. Locked out again, his hand tightened around the cloth in his pocket, dampened with just enough chloroform to keep Ellie calm during the drive to his cabin in Tennessee. By the time anyone realized she was missing, they'd be across state lines. He'd left the custody paperwork half completed on his motel bed. He'd intended to do this legally, but Sarah's lawyer had blocked him at every turn. "Just till Sarah gets clean," he muttered to himself. "The system won't help her in time." Back at the demonstration, Scott was explaining Max's detection abilities. A dog's sense of smell is approximately 40 times stronger than a human's. Max can detect narcotics, explosives, and even certain medical conditions. What Scott didn't mention was how Max sometimes seemed to sense things beyond explanation, like the time he'd led Scott to an unconscious hiker a quarter-mile off the search grid, or how he always placed himself between Scott and the door during thunderstorms, when Scott's memories of Afghanistan grew too vivid. This bond between Handler and K-9 is built on absolute trust, Scott explained to the audience. Max trusts that I'll never put him in unnecessary danger, and I trust that he'll obey every command without hesitation." As if on cue, Max suddenly stiffened, his attention shifting away from Scott for the first time that day. His ears swiveled forward, nose working the air currents. Scott noticed immediately. "Max, focus," he said quietly. The command they used to redirect attention. For the first time in their partnership, Max didn't respond. A low rumble started in his chest. "Everything all right, Harrington?" Chief Morgan called from the sidelines, noticing the change in the dog's demeanor. "Just fine, sir," Scott replied automatically, though a flicker of concern crossed his face. "Max, heel!" The command fell on deaf ears. Max's attention was locked on something across the lawn. Robert Dawson now walking purposefully away from the face-painting booth, carrying what appeared to be a sleeping Ellie, her butterfly-painted face tucked against his shoulder. To most observers, it looked like a father carrying his tired daughter. But Max's heightened senses detected what humans couldn't, the chemical smell of chloroform mingling with the scent of fear. The slightly unnatural limpness of the child's body, the accelerated heartbeat of the man carrying her. "Max, stay," Scott commanded firmly, noticing the tension in his partner's body. Something was wrong. But breaking discipline in the middle of a demonstration was unacceptable. The internal conflict played out in Max's body, his training demanding obedience, his instincts screaming danger. His back legs trembled with the effort to remain seated as Robert passed the outer edge of the crowd, moving toward the parking lot. "Max, stay!" Scott's voice took on the sharp edge that always ensured compliance. For 5 seconds, Max held position, visibly struggling between his training and some powerful instinct. Then Ellie's arm slipped from its position, dangling limply at an unnatural angle that no sleeping child would tolerate. Something primitive and protective overrode 5 years of perfect training, with a sound between a growl and a bark that Scott had never heard before. Max lunged forward with such force that the leather lead snapped like thread. "Max, no!" Scott bellowed, horror and confusion washing over him as his flawlessly trained partner bolted through the crowd, sending people scattering. Chief Morgan stepped forward in alarm. "Scott, what the hell?" But Scott was already running after his dog, wondering what could possibly have broken through years of conditioning and absolute obedience. In 27 years of working with police dogs, he'd never seen anything like it. Max moved like a missile, focused entirely on the man carrying Ellie toward a blue sedan at the edge of the parking lot. Max's powerful body cut through the crowd like water, his singular focus locked on Robert Dawson. The man had just reached the edge of the parking lot when he glanced back and saw 90 pounds of German Shepherd hurtling toward him, teeth bared and eyes blazing with protective fury. "Help call off your dog," Robert shouted, clutching Ellie tighter as he fumbled for his car keys. Families scattered from Max's path, mothers grabbing children, fathers stepping protectively in front. The festive atmosphere of the fall family day dissolved into chaos as screams erupted across the park. "Max, halt!" Scott's command rang out as he sprinted after his partner, but the sound seemed to evaporate in the autumn air. For the first time since their partnership began, the bond of absolute obedience had shattered. 20 yards separated Max from his target when Robert dropped his keys in panic. As he bent to retrieve them, the cloth he'd used on Ellie fell from his pocket, the distinct odor of chloroform now detectable even to human senses. In that moment of distraction, Max closed the distance. With precision that came from countless training sessions, Max didn't aim for the throat or face as an untrained dog might. Instead, he clamped down on Robert's forearm, the arm supporting Ellie's weight, applying pressure to force the man to release his grip without risking harm to the child. Robert's scream pierced the air as Max's teeth sank through his jacket sleeve. "Get him off me! He's attacking me for no reason!" Ellie's limp body began to slip from his grasp. Scott, arriving seconds behind Max, lunged forward to catch the girl before she could hit the pavement. As his arms wrapped around her small form, the sickly sweet smell of chloroform was unmistakable. "Someone call 911, Scott shouted, cradling Ellie while trying to assess her condition. Her breathing was shallow, her pulse rapid but weak under his fingers. More alarming were the raised red hives beginning to appear on her neck and wrists, signs of an allergic reaction. 2 uniformed officers who had been assisting with the demonstration arrived at a run, weapons drawn. "Stand down," Scott ordered them, his military command voice cutting through the chaos. "Suspect is restrained. The child needs medical attention immediately." Chief Morgan pushed through the gathering crowd, his face flushed with exertion and confusion. "What in God's name is happening here? Harrington?" Max maintained his grip on Robert's arm, ignoring the man's struggles and cries. The shepherd's training prevented him from causing serious injury, but he clearly had no intention of releasing his hold without command. "Sir, this man has drugged this child with chloroform," Scott explained quickly, nodding toward the cloth on the ground. "She's having what looks like an allergic reaction. We need an ambulance now." "I'm her father," Robert shouted, still struggling against Max's grip. "This is a misunderstanding. Call off your crazy dog." A woman in the crowd stepped forward. "That's a lie. I know Ellie Barnes and her mother from church. That's not her father." Chief Morgan's face hardened as he turned to an officer. "Call it in. Suspected kidnapping and assault on a minor. Get paramedics here now." As if understanding the gravity of the situation, Max maintained his hold without increasing pressure, even as Robert continued to struggle. The crowd had formed a loose circle around the scene, cell phones recording the dramatic confrontation. "Max, hold!" Scott commanded, his voice steadier now that he understood what was happening. This time, Max responded to the command, maintaining his grip but relaxing enough to show he was once again under control. Paramedics arrived within minutes, taking over Ellie's care with practiced efficiency. Probable chloroform sedation with anaphylactic response, the lead paramedic assessed quickly. "We need to move now." As they loaded Ellie into the ambulance, one paramedic turned to Scott. "Good thing you intercepted when you did. This level of reaction could have been fatal if untreated." The realization hit Scott like a physical blow. Max hadn't just disobeyed a command, he'd potentially saved a life by doing so. Officers had handcuffed Robert, who continued to protest. "You don't understand, her mother's an addict. I was trying to help her. Save it for the station." Chief Morgan growled, nodding to the officers to take him away. As the suspect was led to a patrol car, Scott finally gave the command, "Max, release." Immediately, Max let go of Robert's arm and returned to Scott's side, sitting at perfect attention as if the past few minutes of disobedience had never happened. Blood stained his muzzle, but his eyes were clear and focused once more. Chief Morgan turned to Scott, his expression unreadable. "In 30 years of law enforcement, I've never seen anything like that. Your dog broke every protocol in the book. Yes, sir, Scott acknowledged, his hand resting on Max's head. The implications were starting to sink in. In police K-9 work, absolute obedience wasn't optional, it was essential. A dog that selectively followed commands was considered dangerous and unpredictable, regardless of the outcome. You realize I'll have to pull him from service pending a full review, Morgan continued, his voice softening slightly. Whatever his intentions, we can't have a K-9 that disregards handler commands. Scott felt the words like a punch to the gut. Max was more than his partner. After his divorce and military retirement, the shepherd had become his reason to get up each morning. I understand, sir. The festival had effectively ended, families hurrying to their cars while police secured the scene. Evidence technicians bagged the chloroform-soaked cloth while officers took statements from witnesses. I want you both in my office tomorrow morning, Morgan said, his tone making it clear this wasn't a request. 0900 sharp. We'll need to figure out what happens next. As the chief walked away, Scott knelt beside Max, examining him for any injuries from the confrontation. The shepherd looked up at him with those intelligent amber eyes, and Scott could swear he saw no regret there, only the satisfaction of a duty fulfilled. You've really done it this time, buddy, Scott murmured, throat tight with conflicting emotions. Pride in Max's protective instinct warred with professional concern about his broken training. What did you sense that I missed? Officer Jenkins approached cautiously. They want you to follow to the hospital. Get checked out since you handled the girl. Plus, they'll need your statement. Scott nodded, clipping a new lead to Max's collar. What about him? Jenkins looked uncomfortable. Chief says he's suspended from duty. Protocol requires he stay at the K-9 facility until the review board makes a decision. The thought of leaving Max in the sterile kennels of the training facility made Scott's chest tighten. But he knew better than to argue. Give me a minute with him first. When Jenkins stepped away, Scott knelt again to look his partner in the eyes. I don't know what you picked up on back there, but I trust you had your reasons. We'll figure this out. Max pressed his muzzle briefly against Scott's palm, a rare show of affection while still in working gear. For the first time that day, Scott felt certain that whatever happened next, Max had made the right call even if it had broken every rule in the book. The fluorescent lights of Augusta General Hospital cast harsh shadows across the waiting room where Scott sat, elbows on knees, staring at the linoleum floor. The clock on the wall read 7:43 p.m., nearly 5 hours since Max had broken training and changed everything. Without his partner's solid presence beside him, Scott felt oddly vulnerable, like he'd lost a limb. Coffee. Officer Jenkins appeared, holding out a paper cup of what passed for coffee in hospital vending machines. Thanks. Scott accepted it gratefully, though the bitter liquid was the last thing his churning stomach needed. Any word on the girl? Jenkins shook his head. Still in with the doctors. That allergic reaction hit her hard. Scott's mind kept replaying the scene in the park, Max's sudden alertness, the inexplicable break in training, the perfect precision of his bite to immobilize without maiming. In 27 years working with military and police dogs, he'd never witnessed such deliberate disobedience with such seemingly purposeful intent. The uncles lawyered up. Jenkins continued, dropping into the chair beside Scott. Claims he was rescuing his niece from an abusive situation. Says his sister, the girl's mother, is deep into opioids and neglecting the kid. Scott grunted non-committally. It wasn't his place to speculate, but the situation stirred uncomfortable memories. Officer Harrington. A doctor in blue scrubs approached, clipboard in hand. I'm Dr. Levine, overseeing Ellie Barnes's care. She's stabilized, but I'd like to ask you about the substance used to sedate her. Scott described the chloroform cloth, the girl's condition when he'd reached her, the rapidly developing hives. The doctor nodded grimly. That tracks with what we're seeing. She's experiencing a severe allergic reaction to the chloroform, complicated by her low body weight and what appears to be existing malnutrition. If she'd remained sedated much longer without treatment, the outcome could have been significantly worse. The implication hung in the air. Max's intervention, however unorthodox, had likely saved Ellie's life. When can I speak with her? Scott asked. She's still unconscious. We're monitoring her closely. Dr. Levine hesitated. There's something else. During our examination, we found evidence of long-term neglect, malnutrition, untreated minor infections, signs of irregular sleep patterns. Child Services has been notified. Scott's jaw tightened. The kidnapper's claims about the mother's neglect might have merit after all. It complicated an already messy situation. Where's her mother? En route, supposedly. Jenkins replied. Patrol picked her up at home. She was... He glanced at the doctor, choosing his words carefully. Not in a condition to drive herself. After the doctor left, Scott sank back into the uncomfortable plastic chair. His mind drifted to 3 years ago, the failed operation in Kandahar that still haunted his nights. He'd followed protocol to the letter that day, holding his K-9 unit back when his instinct screamed to send them in. By the time reinforcements arrived, the building had collapsed, killing 3 hostages, including a child not much older than Ellie. His commanding officer had commended his discipline. You followed procedure, Harrington. The outcome isn't on you. But Scott knew better. Sometimes procedure wasn't enough. Sometimes instinct, human or canine, saw what training couldn't. You should head home, Jenkins suggested. Nothing more to do here tonight. Can't, Scott replied simply. Home meant an empty house without Max. And that wasn't home at all, as if reading his thoughts. Jenkins added, Chief pulled some strings. Max isn't in the kennel. He's at Morgan's place. His wife's looking after him. Relief washed through Scott. Chief Morgan's wife treated their dogs like children. Max would be comfortable there, at least. I still need to check on the girl, Scott insisted. Something about Ellie's situation had gotten under his skin, beyond professional obligation. Suit yourself. I'll bring you some real coffee in the morning. Jenkins squeezed his shoulder before leaving, alone in the waiting room. Scott closed his eyes, exhaustion settling into his bones. At 53, recovery from stress took longer than it once had. The adrenaline crash left him drained. His phone buzzed a text from Morgan. Dog's fine, eating my wife's pot roast and sleeping on my couch. Board meeting tomorrow 9 a.m. sharp. Get some rest. Despite everything, Scott smiled faintly. Max had a way of charming everyone eventually. A commotion at the entrance drew his attention. A thin, disheveled woman in her 30s was arguing with the reception nurse, her voice rising shrilly. "I'm her mother. You have to let me see her." Scott recognized Sarah Barnes from the case briefing Jenkins had shown him. Even from a distance, the signs of addiction were evident, the slight tremor in her hands, rapid movements, dilated pupils. 2 police officers flanked her, clearly having escorted her from home. One noticed Scott and nodded in recognition. Scott approached slowly. "Miss Barnes, I'm Officer Harrington. I was there when your daughter was found." Sarah's bloodshot eyes fixed on him, her expression shifting from anger to confusion. "Found? What do you mean, found?" Bobby was watching her while I ran errands. The officers exchanged glances. Clearly, she didn't understand what had happened or was pretending not to. "Your brother attempted to take Ellie out of state," Scott explained gently. "He used chloroform to sedate her, which triggered a severe allergic reaction. She's being treated now." Sarah's face crumpled, tears cutting tracks through her makeup. "No, that's not. Bobby wouldn't." She swayed slightly, steadying herself against the wall. "I need to see my baby." "The doctors are with her now," Scott said. "Why don't we sit down while we wait?" To his surprise, she followed him to the waiting area, collapsing into a chair. Up close, her deterioration was more evident, once pretty features now gaunt, arms bearing the telltale marks of addiction. "Bobby's always trying to take her," Sarah muttered, pulling her thin jacket tighter around herself. "Says I'm not fit. Says I'm just like our mom." Scott remained silent, letting her talk. Years of interrogation experience had taught him that silence often elicited more information than questions. "I'm trying. You know," she continued, voice breaking. "Got clean last month. Slipped up yesterday. But that was just—" "It was the anniversary of Mark's death, and I just needed something to take the edge off." Mark Ellie's father. Scott recalled Jenkins mentioning he'd been killed in action. "Army?" Scott asked quietly. Sarah looked up, surprised. "How'd you know?" "Recognize the memorial bracelet." Scott nodded toward the worn metal band on her wrist, similar to one he'd worn for years after losing friends in Afghanistan. "3rd Battalion, 5th Marines," Sarah replied, touching the bracelet. "IED in Helmand Province. Ellie was 4. The common ground of military connection shifted something in the conversation. Sarah's defensive posture relaxed slightly. "I was Army," Scott offered. 20 years. "Mark would have made career too," Sarah said softly. "He loved it. When they came to the door in their uniforms, I already knew. Ellie kept asking when Daddy was coming home for weeks afterward." The familiar story twisted something in Scott's chest. He'd seen too many families destroyed by war, including his own. His ex-wife hadn't waited for his 3rd deployment to end before finding comfort elsewhere. "Ms. Barnes?" A new voice interrupted. A severe-looking woman in a pantsuit approached, ID badge identifying her as Diane Mercer, Child Protective Services. "I need to speak with you regarding your daughter's situation." Sarah's momentary openness vanished, her expression hardening. "You're not taking her." "Let's discuss this privately," Mercer insisted, guiding Sarah toward a consultation room. Scott watched them go, a heaviness settling in his chest. The situation was all too familiar, a family fractured by trauma. A child caught in the middle. Everyone believing they knew what was best. His phone buzzed again, an email notification from the department. Administrative Leave Notice Officer Scott Harrington. The bureaucratic wheels were already turning. By putting him on leave, they were signaling the seriousness of Max's protocol breach. Around midnight, Dr. Levine returned. Officer Ellie's awake and asking about the dog. Scott looked up in surprise. She's asking about Max. She keeps saying a dog saved her from the bad man. Wants to thank him. The doctor smiled slightly. Seems your partner made quite an impression. Can I see her, Dr. Levine hesitated. Briefly, CPS has restricted visitors, but I think this falls under official police business. Scott followed him through the pediatric ward to a private room where Ellie sat propped up in bed, a teddy bear clutched to her chest. Despite the butterfly face paint now smudged across her cheek, she looked alarmingly small and pale against the white hospital sheets. Ellie, Dr. Levine spoke gently. This is Officer Harrington. His dog is the one who helped you today. The girl's blue eyes, so much like her mother's, studied Scott warily. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. Where is he? Scott moved slowly to the chair beside her bed, keeping his movements non-threatening. Years of working with traumatized veterans had taught him the value of calm, deliberate actions. His name is Max, Scott explained. He's resting now, but he's a police dog who helps people. He knew, Ellie said simply. Knew what, sweetheart? That Uncle Bobby was being bad. I told him I didn't want to go, but he said Mommy sent him. Her fingers twisted in the bedsheet. Then he put the stinky cloth on my face, and it hurt to breathe. Scott nodded, keeping his expression neutral despite the anger flaring inside. Max is very good at knowing when something's wrong. Can I see him? Ellie asked, a hint of animation entering her face for the first time. Maybe soon, Scott hedged, not wanting to make promises he couldn't keep. With Max suspended and Ellie in protective custody, a reunion seemed unlikely. He'd like to see you too. The dog saved my life, Ellie stated with the simple certainty of a child. Uncle Bobby said the medicine would make me sleep, but it made my throat close up instead. It always does. Scott's attention sharpened. This happened before. Ellie nodded solemnly. When I had surgery on my ear, the doctor said I'm allergic to sleepy medicine. The missing piece clicked into place. Max hadn't just smelled the chloroform, he'd somehow detected Ellie's allergic reaction beginning, perhaps through subtle changes in her scent as the anaphylaxis developed. Thank you for telling me that. Ellie, it's very important information. A nurse appeared in the doorway. Officer, Ms. Mercer is asking that you wrap up. Ellie needs her rest. Scott stood, oddly reluctant to leave. I'll tell Max you said thank you. Okay. For the first time, Ellie smiled, a small, fragile thing that transformed her face. Tell him he's a good boy. He's Outside the room, Scott nearly collided with Robert Dawson, now flanked by two officers and sporting a heavily bandaged forearm. They're booking me, Robert said flatly, recognizing Scott. But I want you to know, I was trying to save her. Sarah's killing herself with those pills, and she's taking Ellie down with her. By drugging a child with a known anesthetic allergy. Scott challenged. Robert's face drained of color. What? No, I didn't know about any allergy. Convenient, Scott replied, stepping aside to let the officers continue their escort. Check their house, Robert called over his shoulder. Check the prescription bottles, the men coming and going at all hours. Check her school attendance record. I was wrong to take her. But I'm not wrong about Sarah. Scott watched them disappear around the corner, troubled by the desperation in the man's voice. It didn't excuse kidnapping, but it raised questions that needed answers. Dawn was breaking when Scott finally left the hospital, having given his formal statement to the detectives assigned to the case. Exhaustion dragged at him as he drove to the police station, knowing the disciplinary board would be convening soon to determine Max's fate and, by extension, his own. The K-9 Training Center stood behind the main police building, a state-of-the-art facility Scott had helped design after joining the department. Usually, the sound of dogs training brought him satisfaction. Today, the kennel's emptiness as he passed felt like an omen. Chief Morgan was waiting in his office, looking as though he hadn't slept either. Hell of a mess. Harrington. Yes, sir. Scott remained standing, back straight, old military habits resurfacing under stress. Dog did good work, Morgan continued, surprising Scott. Girl would have died otherwise. According to the doctors, allergic reaction was already advanced when paramedics got to her. Max detected it before any human could have noticed, Scott explained. Ellie confirmed she has a documented anaphylactic response to anesthetics. There's no way Dawson could have known it wasn't in any public record. Morgan nodded thoughtfully. Doesn't change the fact that he disobeyed direct commands from his handler in a public setting. The board's already nervous after those lawsuits in Atlanta last year. Scott knew the cases. He meant K-9 officers accused of excessive force, resulting in six-figure settlements and stricter protocols statewide. Max's actions saved a life, Scott argued. Surely that counts for something. It does with me, Morgan admitted. But I'm one vote of 5. The others are concerned about liability, future unpredictability. He sighed heavily. You know how it works, Scott. A K-9 that selectively obeys commands is considered dangerous, regardless of outcomes. The unspoken reality hung between them. Dogs who failed certification were typically removed from service permanently. Some were adopted by their handlers if temperament allowed, but many, especially those with bite training, were considered too liability-prone for civilian placement. He deserves better than this, Scott said quietly. So prove it, Morgan replied. Board convenes in 30 minutes. Make your case. I've seen you talk your way out of worse situations. Scott nodded, determination replacing fatigue. Permission to bring Max in. They need to see him. Morgan hesitated, then nodded. Karen's got him in our backyard. Says he's been a perfect gentleman, though he stole a biscuit when she wasn't looking. For the first time in 24 hours, Scott smiled genuinely. Sounds like him. As he drove to Morgan's house to collect Max, Scott's mind worked through his strategy for the hearing. This wasn't just about saving a dog's career, it was about recognizing when instinct superseded training, when breaking protocol was the only moral choice. The parallel to his own military experience wasn't lost on him. 3 years ago, he'd chosen protocol over instinct, with devastating consequences. Perhaps Max's act of disobedience was offering him a chance at redemption he hadn't known he needed. The fluorescent lights of Conference Room B hummed overhead as 5 stern-faced department officials reviewed the documentation spread before them. Scott stood at parade rest beside Max, who sat perfectly at attention, showing none of yesterday's defiance. To anyone watching, the shepherd appeared to be the model of canine discipline, the very picture of the reliable police dog he'd been before yesterday's incident. Chief Morgan sat at the center of the table, flanked by Deputy Chief Rivera, the department's legal counsel, Catherine Winters, K-9 Unit Supervisor Martinez, and Dr. Phillips, the department's veterinary consultant. The group represented the full authority of the department's review board, convened on short notice to address what the paperwork clinically described as K-9 protocol violation handler command refusal. "Let's begin," Chief Morgan announced, his voice deliberately neutral, despite the supportive glance he cast toward Scott. "Officer Harrington, the board understands that K-9 Officer Max violated direct handler commands yesterday during a public demonstration, resulting in the apprehension of Robert Dawson and the recovery of a minor, Ellie Barnes. Is that an accurate summary?" "Yes, sir, but with critical context missing," Scott replied, his voice steady despite the knot in his stomach. 20 years in the military had taught him how to address superior officers, even when his future hung in the balance. Max detected a threat that no human present could have identified at that distance. Martinez leaned forward, skepticism evident in his expression. "You're claiming the dog knew something you didn't. That's a slippery slope. Harrington, either these animals follow commands or they don't. There's no middle ground in this work." "With respect, sir, that's not entirely accurate." Scott gestured toward Max, who remained motionless, amber eyes tracking each speaker. K-9s are trained to alert handlers to explosives, narcotics, and cadaverous substances we can't detect without their assistance. Max detected a combination of chloroform and the early stages of anaphylactic shock in a child with a documented medical condition. Dr. Phillips, the veterinarian, looked intrigued. "There are documented cases of dogs detecting seizures, blood sugar changes, even certain cancers. But anaphylaxis is a new one. I've brought Ellie Barnes's medical records, obtained with her mother's permission this morning." Scott placed a folder on the table. "She has a severe documented allergy to most anesthetic agents, including chloroform. Her previous exposure during a tonsillectomy at age 4 resulted in emergency intervention." Catherine Winters, the department attorney, examined the records with a frown. "This still doesn't justify command refusal. If the dog detected something suspicious, he should have alerted you according to protocol, not acted independently." "He did alert," Scott countered. "His body language, ear position, and vocalization all indicated detection. I misinterpreted his alerts as distraction and issued correction commands instead of investigating." "So you're saying this was handler error?" Rivera asked, eyebrows raised. "I'm saying this was a situation where Max's sensory capabilities exceeded my own understanding of the threat." Scott met each board member's eyes in turn. "By the time I recognized the danger, Dawson would have reached his vehicle with Ellie. According to her doctors, she would have likely suffered respiratory arrest within minutes after that point." Morgan cleared his throat. "I've spoken with Augusta General. They've confirmed that the girl's allergic reaction was advanced enough that delayed treatment would have resulted in potential fatality. While that outcome would have been tragic, Winters interjected, it doesn't change our central concern. A K-9 that selectively obeys commands presents an unacceptable liability risk. What happens next time he decides his judgment supersedes his handlers? The question hung in the air, the crux of the entire hearing. Police K-9s were extensively trained for absolute reliability. Their value in the field depended on handlers knowing exactly how they would respond in any situation. "Permission to demonstrate something?" Scott asked. Morgan nodded cautiously. "Proceed." Scott turned to Max, issuing a series of standard commands: sit, down, stay, come, which Max executed flawlessly. Then he removed a small vial from his pocket. "This contains a sample of Ellie's hospital gown from yesterday, which still carries traces of chloroform and her biochemical stress markers." He placed it on the floor several feet away. "Max, find—" Max's demeanor transformed instantly. He sniffed the air, then moved with purpose toward the vial, giving the same distinct alert posture he'd displayed in the park, ears forward, body tense, a specific low vocalization. "This is exactly how he alerted yesterday before breaking command," Scott explained. "I mistook it for distraction because we've never trained specifically for anaphylaxis detection. But he recognized a life-threatening situation and acted to prevent it." Dr. Phillips leaned forward with interest. "You're suggesting he made a judgment call between competing imperatives, obedience versus protection of life?" "Exactly." Scott felt a glimmer of hope at having at least one board member grasp his point. Max didn't randomly disobey. He prioritized his primary function, public safety, over the secondary function of demonstration obedience. Martinez shook his head. "That's anthropomorphizing. Harrington, dogs don't make ethical judgments." "With respect, sir, that view contradicts current understanding of canine cognition." Scott had spent the pre-dawn hours researching scientific literature to support his case. Working dogs regularly make complex situational assessments. The question isn't whether Max can make judgments, but whether his judgment in this specific case was sound. "And you believe it was?" Chief Morgan asked. "The evidence speaks for itself," Scott replied. "Max detected a threat no human present could have identified, took precise action that neutralized the threat while minimizing harm, and saved a child's life in the process." Catherine Winters remained unconvinced. "The department can't afford the liability of a K-9 that might disregard commands in the field. What if next time his assessment is wrong?" Scott took a deep breath. Knowing he was about to cross a line into personal territory he rarely discussed. "May I speak freely about something from my military service?" Morgan looked surprised but nodded. "If it's relevant. 3 years ago in Afghanistan, I was commanding a K-9 unit during a hostage extraction. Intelligence indicated 3 American aid workers were being held in a compound outside Kandahar." The memories Scott usually kept carefully compartmentalized came flooding back: the dust, the heat, the radio chatter. My dog, Rex, started displaying agitation behaviors at the perimeter. Similar to Max yesterday, protocol dictated we wait for EOD clearance before entry. The room had gone completely silent. Even Martinez's pen stopped its scratching. "I followed protocol, held position, ordered Rex to maintain 2. Scott's voice remained steady, though Max sensed his distress and pressed slightly against his leg. 20 minutes later, we heard the explosion, The Tangos had rigged the building. All 3 hostages died, including a 19-year-old volunteer teacher. He looked up, meeting Chief Morgan's gaze directly. The after-action report commended my adherence to protocol. Said I'd made the correct call given the information available. But Rex knew something was wrong. He tried to tell me, and I chose procedure over his instinct. I've lived with that decision every day since. Dr. Phillips broke the uncomfortable silence. You believe Rex detected explosives that weren't in your intelligence briefing. I believe he sensed the immediate danger that I, with all my training and equipment, missed completely. Scott rested his hand on Max's head. Yesterday, when Max alerted to a threat I couldn't see, I had a choice: trust his training to obey or trust his instinct to protect. This time, he made the choice for me, and a child is alive because of it. Deputy Chief Rivera studied Scott thoughtfully. You realize you're making an argument that could fundamentally change canine protocols if we accept that dogs can override handler commands based on their assessment of threat. It opens questions about liability, training standards, operational procedures. I'm not suggesting all canines should have this discretion, Scott clarified. I'm suggesting that Max demonstrated exceptional judgment in an exceptional circumstance, and that judgment deserves recognition, not punishment. Catherine Winters flipped through her notes with a frown. The precedent concerns me, but I can't ignore the outcome. Legally speaking, we're in stronger position defending an officer, even a 4-legged one, who prevented a child's death than we would be explaining why our protocols led to tragedy. Chief Morgan glanced at the other board members. We need to deliberate. Officer Harrington, please wait outside with Max. In the hallway, Scott sank onto a bench, the adrenaline of his presentation fading into exhaustion. Max sat beside him, resting his head on Scott's knee in a rare display of off-duty affection. You did good, buddy, Scott murmured, scratching behind the shepherd's ears. Whatever they decide, you did the right thing. His phone buzzed with a text from Jenkins. Hospital update girl asking for the dog again. Mom in custody. Failed drug test. CPS looking for placement options. The message tugged at something in Scott's chest. Ellie's situation was still precarious. Caught between a mother unable to care for her and an uncle who'd chosen a criminal approach to helping her. 30 minutes later, the conference room door opened. We're ready, Chief Morgan announced. Scott and Max resumed their positions before the board, whose expressions gave nothing away. After review of the evidence and testimony, Morgan began formally. This board finds that K-9 Officer Max acted within the broader scope of his duty to protect public safety, though outside standard protocol parameters. Scott held his breath, feeling Max tense slightly beside him. Given the exceptional circumstances and life-saving outcome, we are implementing the following first. K-9 Officer Max will be reinstated to active duty, contingent on completing a 30-day retraining and assessment period. Relief flooded through Scott, but Morgan wasn't finished. Second, Officer Harrington, you will work with Dr. Phillips to document Max's apparent ability to detect anaphylactic responses for potential development of a training protocol. Scott nodded, surprised by this unexpected direction. Finally, Morgan continued, his expression softening slightly. This board recommends commendation for both Handler and K-9 for actions resulting in the rescue of a minor from imminent life-threatening danger. Martinez cleared his throat. I want the record to show I still have reservations about the precedent this sets, but I cannot argue with the outcome in this specific case." "Noted," Morgan replied. "This hearing is adjourned." As the board members gathered their papers, Dr. Phillips approached Scott. "I'd like to begin testing Max's detection capabilities as soon as possible. This could be groundbreaking for medical alert training. He'll be available after his retraining period." Scott agreed, still processing the unexpected positive outcome. Chief Morgan was the last to leave, pausing beside Scott. "You made a compelling case, Harrington. But don't think this means any K-9 can start freelancing in the field. Max is the exception, not the new rule." "Understood, sir." "Thank you. One more thing," Morgan added quietly. "The Barnes girl. Her situation's a mess. Mother's facing charges. Uncle too. CPS is scrambling for placement options." Scott frowned. "What happens to her now?" "That's above my pay grade," Morgan replied with a sigh. "But considering the connection she seems to have formed with your partner here, maybe you could pay her another visit. Might do her some good to see a friendly face." As Morgan walked away, Scott knelt beside Max, cupping the shepherd's face in his hands. "You hear that, buddy? We're still a team." Max's tail swept once across the polished floor, the only breach in his professional demeanor, but enough to convey everything Scott needed to know. Whatever challenges lay ahead for both of them, they would face them together. Augusta General Hospital seemed less intimidating in daylight, though the antiseptic smell still burned Scott's nostrils as he made his way through the pediatric ward 3 days after the incident. Max walked precisely at his heel, specially approved for this visit after considerable paperwork and a thorough bath. The service vest he wore, different from his police harness, identified him as a therapy dog, a technical distinction that had allowed Chief Morgan to approve this visit despite Max's retraining status. Outside Ellie's room, Scott paused, surprised to find Sarah Barnes seated in a plastic chair in the hallway, her eyes red-rimmed and hands trembling slightly. She looked marginally better than she had during their first encounter, her hair washed. Wearing clean clothes, but the strain of the past days showed in the dark circles beneath her eyes and the nervous way she picked at her fingernails. "Officer Harrington," she acknowledged, her voice hoarse. "They told me you were coming." "Ms. Barnes." Scott nodded, keeping his tone neutral. "How's Ellie doing?" Sarah's gaze dropped to her hands. "Better. They're releasing her tomorrow." A bitter laugh escaped her. "Not to me, of course. CPS has made that very clear." "I'm sorry to hear that," Scott said, and meant it. Despite her obvious issues, the pain of separation from her daughter was written plainly across Sarah's face. "They're letting me have supervised visits twice a week if I stay in the program." She gestured vaguely toward a paper wristband, the kind issued by rehabilitation facilities. 30 days inpatient, then intensive outpatient. Might be 6 months before they even consider returning custody. Max sat patiently during this exchange, but his attention remained fixed on Ellie's door, as if he could sense her presence beyond it. "That's a good first step," Scott offered, unsure what comfort he could provide. "Showing commitment to recovery. Wouldn't have done it without Bobby scaring me straight," Sarah admitted quietly, surprising Scott. "What he did was wrong. God, he could have killed her with that chloroform, but he wasn't wrong about me. I've been a mess," since Mark died. The unexpected self-awareness caught Scott off guard. In his experience, most addicts in Sarah's position remain defensive, angry at the system rather than acknowledging their role in the situation. "Ellie needs her mother," Scott said simply. "Getting help is the strongest thing you could do for her." Sarah's eyes welled with fresh tears. "She's all I have left of Mark. I can't lose her too." She wiped roughly at her face with the sleeve of her sweatshirt. "They're letting me sit with her after your visit. The social worker has to be present, like I'm some kind of monster who might hurt my own child." The anguish in her voice resonated with Scott more than he cared to admit. He understood all too well how trauma could send a life spiraling out of control. If not for Max and the structure of the K-9 unit, his own post-military transition might have ended very differently. "One day at a time," he offered, the platitude sounding hollow even to his own ears. "That's all any of us can do." Sarah nodded vaguely, then gestured toward the door. "She's been asking about your dog non-stop. Go on in. I think you're the only visitor she's actually been excited to see." Inside, Ellie sat cross-legged on the hospital bed, looking markedly improved from Scott's last visit. Color had returned to her cheeks, and the IV lines were gone from her small arms. She was laboriously coloring a picture book, her tongue caught between her teeth in concentration, while a tired-looking social worker Scott recognized as Diane Mercer from CPS sat nearby, tapping on a tablet. Ellie's head snapped up at their entrance, her eyes widening at the sight of Max. For a moment, she seemed frozen in place, crayon suspended above the page. "Hello, Ellie," Scott said gently. "Someone wanted to see how you're doing." A smile transformed the child's face, erasing the worry lines that no 7-year-old should carry. "Max," she whispered, as if saying his name too loudly might make him disappear. Max remained perfectly disciplined beside Scott, though his tail gave a single hopeful wag at hearing his name. "He remembers you," Scott told her. "Would you like to say hello to him?" Ellie nodded eagerly, scooting to the edge of the bed. "Ms. Mercer looked up sharply. "The dog needs to maintain distance from the patient. Hospital regulations. He's a certified police K-9 with additional therapy training," Scott replied smoothly, stretching the truth only slightly. "He's been approved for this visit specifically." The social worker frowned, but returned to her tablet, watching closely. "Max, visit," Scott commanded softly. It was an official command in their repertoire, giving Max permission to approach for gentle interaction rather than working contact. The shepherd padded forward with deliberate gentleness, stopping beside Ellie's bed and raising his muzzle to her eye level. His entire demeanor shifted from the alert intensity of a working dog to something softer, almost tender, as if he recognized the child's fragility. Ellie reached out with hesitant fingers, touching Max's head with a reverence that made Scott's throat tighten unexpectedly. "He saved me," she said, the simple statement directed at no one in particular. "When the bad medicine was hurting me, he knew." "Yes, he did," Scott confirmed. "Max is very special that way." For several minutes, Ellie stroked Max's fur, her small fingers tracing the pattern of black and tan, occasionally whispering something in the dog's ear that Scott couldn't hear. Max remained perfectly still, his usual restless energy completely subdued in the child's presence. "The doctors said the medicine Uncle Bobby used makes most people just sleepy." Ellie explained suddenly, her voice stronger than Scott had yet heard it. "But it makes me sick, because I'm allergic." How did Max know that? Scott considered how to explain complex concepts of scent detection to a 7-year-old. Max can smell things that people can't. When your body started having an allergic reaction, it released special chemicals. Max smelled those and knew you were in danger. Ellie nodded solemnly, as if this made perfect sense to her. Like when Mommy says she can smell a storm coming before it rains. Something like that, Scott agreed. Miss... Mercer cleared her throat. "Ellie, would you like to show Officer Harrington the drawing you made?" Ellie brightened, reaching for a paper on her bedside table. "I made this for Max. Can he have it?" Scott accepted the crayon drawing, a surprisingly detailed rendering of a German shepherd standing protectively beside a small blonde girl. Above them, written in careful block letters, "My hero Max." "I think we'll frame this for the K9 office," Scott said, genuinely touched. "Max will see it every day." The child beamed. Then her expression grew serious again. "Where am I going tomorrow?" The question caught Scott off guard. He glanced at Mercer, uncertain how much Ellie understood about her situation. The social worker set down her tablet with a sigh. "Ellie, like we discussed, you'll be staying with a foster family while your mom gets better. They're very nice people with a big backyard." Ellie's lower lip trembled slightly. "But no dogs?" "No dogs," Mercer confirmed gently. "Mrs. Henderson is allergic to dogs, remember?" The disappointment on Ellie's face was heartbreaking. Scott had seen the same expression on his own daughter's face years ago, during the painful conversations about his divorce and deployment. "Can Max visit me there?" Ellie asked, her eyes pleading. Before Scott could formulate a response, Mercer intervened. "That's not possible. Ellie, the foster home is all the way across town, and Officer Harrington and Max have important police work to do." Ellie's shoulders slumped, her hands stilling on Max's fur. "Oh." Something twisted in Scott's chest, a familiar ache he'd carried since watching his own family drift away during his military years. How many times had his daughter asked if he could visit, only to be told duty came first? "Your mother is working very hard to get better so you can be together again," Scott offered, knowing the words were inadequate comfort to a child facing separation from everything familiar. "That's what Uncle Bobby said, too," Ellie whispered. "But he was lying." The simple statement hung in the air, devastating in its child's understanding of adult betrayal. Even Max seemed to sense the shift in mood, pressing his muzzle gently against Ellie's hand as if in reassurance. "Ms." Mercer checked her watch. "Ellie, your mother's visit is scheduled next. We should wrap up here." Scott nodded, recognizing the dismissal. "Max, back," he commanded softly, with obvious reluctance. Max returned to his position at Scott's side, though his eyes remained fixed on Ellie. "Thank you for coming," Ellie said formally, as if repeating words she'd been taught. "And thank you for saving me, Max." In the hallway, Scott found Sarah still waiting, now joined by an older woman with silver hair, and Sarah's same blue eyes, Ellie's grandmother, he presumed. "I'm Martha Simmons, Sarah's mother," the woman confirmed, extending her hand. "I wanted to thank you personally for what you did for my granddaughter." Miss Scott shook her hand, noting the strength in her grip despite her age. "Max deserves the credit. I was just following his lead." Martha's gaze dropped to Max, assessing him with the same direct blue eyes her daughter and granddaughter shared. "Smart dog." "The smartest," Scott agreed. "Too bad he can't testify about what's best for Ellie," Martha said with surprising bitterness. "These people won't even consider letting her stay with me because I live in the same building as Sarah. Like I didn't raise 3 children of my own just fine." Scott remained silent, recognizing the familiar frustration with bureaucratic systems that often seem designed for procedure rather than people. "Mom, please," Sarah whispered. "Not now." Martha straightened her spine, dignity reasserting itself. "Well, we'll keep fighting. That's what family does." As Scott led Max toward the elevator, the weight of Ellie's situation settled on his shoulders alongside his own concerns. The system designed to protect children like her often fell short, creating new traumas while addressing existing ones. The parallel to his military experience, where following protocol had sometimes caused more harm than good, wasn't lost on him. Like Max in the park, sometimes the right action defied the established rules. The question was whether he had the courage to recognize when those moments arose in his own life. The interrogation room at Augusta Police Department had seen better days. Scuff marks marred the pale green walls, and the fluorescent light flickered intermittently, casting strange shadows across Robert Dawson's face as he sat across from Scott. 3 days of detention had left Ellie's uncle disheveled, his normally neat appearance replaced by a prison jumpsuit and uncombed hair. The bandage on his arm where Max had bitten him was visible beneath his sleeve. Scott hadn't planned this visit. In fact, Chief Morgan had explicitly advised against it, concerned about the appearance of impropriety. But after seeing Ellie and Sarah at the hospital, the gaps in the case nagged at him. Standard procedure would let the assigned detectives handle the investigation while Scott focused on Max's retraining. But something about this case had gotten under his skin. "I appreciate you agreeing to talk," Scott began, keeping his tone professional despite the churning in his gut. "This isn't an official interview, just trying to understand the full picture." Robert studied him warily. "Your dog nearly took my arm off. Why would I help you?" "Because you care about Ellie," Scott replied simply. "And right now, her future is uncertain." Something shifted in Robert's expression, a flash of genuine pain that transcended his physical injury. "How is she? Recovering well physically. Being discharged to foster care tomorrow." Robert closed his eyes briefly. "Not with Sarah. Your sister failed a drug test. She's entered rehab, but regaining custody will take months, if it happens at all. And they won't consider me, because I'm now a kidnapper." Bitterness laced Robert's words. "Perfect." Scott leaned forward. "I need to understand why you did it. Not the justification you gave the detectives, but the real reason. What made kidnapping seem like the only option?" For a long moment, Robert remained silent, studying the table between them. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost its defensive edge. "Did you know our mother was an addict prescription painkillers? Just like Sarah. She'd be fine for months, then relapse, over and over." He rubbed his face wearily. "Dad left when I was 12. Sarah was 8. Said he couldn't watch Mom destroy herself anymore." Scott nodded, letting him talk. He'd reviewed Robert's background check clean record, Stable job as an accountant in Nashville. Divorced 3 years prior with no children. I practically raised Sarah after that. Made sure she ate, got to school, had clean clothes. Social services came around a few times, but Mom always pulled herself together just enough to keep us. A humorless laugh escaped him. Sound familiar? The parallel to Ellie's situation was unmistakable. History repeating itself. Scott acknowledged, I got out as soon as I could. College scholarship. Moved away. Built a life. Begged Sarah to come with me. But she wouldn't leave Mom. Robert's fingers traced abstract patterns on the table. When she met Mark, I thought she'd escaped the cycle. He was solid, responsible. Then he was killed, and the prescription for grief turned into something else. When did you first notice problems with Ellie's care? Last Christmas. I visited and found the house filthy. Barely any food. Ellie was wearing the same clothes 3 days running. Robert's jaw tightened. I confronted Sarah, and she promised to get help. I believed her, wanted to believe her. I went back to Nashville thinking things would improve. But they didn't, Scott prompted. I started calling Ellie regularly, checking in. The things she told me. He shook his head. Strange men in the house at all hours. Being left alone overnight. Going to school hungry. I called CPS twice. But Sarah always managed to clean up her act just long enough for them to close the file. Scott had seen the pattern before the system's limitations when dealing with functioning addicts who could temporarily pull themselves together for official scrutiny. 2 weeks ago, I took leave from work, came to Augusta, thinking I'd try one more time to convince Sarah to let Ellie stay with me while she got help. Robert's voice hardened. Found out she'd pulled Ellie from school 3 weeks earlier. Neighbors hadn't seen either of them for days. When they finally came home, Sarah could barely stand up straight, and Ellie looked like she hadn't bathed in a week. So you decided to take matters into your own hands. Robert met Scott's gaze directly. I filed for emergency custody the next day. Judge scheduled a hearing for next month. Next month? The frustration in his voice was palpable. Meanwhile, Ellie's living in filth with a mother who passes out and leaves her to fend for herself. What was I supposed to do? Wait for something terrible to happen? The justification rang with uncomfortable familiarity. How many times in Afghanistan had Scott seen the system fail the very people it was designed to protect? Rules and protocols that looked sensible on paper often crumbled in the face of human reality. Why the chloroform? Scott asked. The key question that had troubled him from the beginning. Robert's expression clouded with shame. I panicked. Sarah spotted me at the festival and threatened to disappear with Ellie if I kept pursuing custody. I knew if they vanished, the system would never find them in time. He rubbed his bandaged arm. I had the chloroform from work. We use it in small amounts for cleaning specialized equipment. I just wanted her to sleep during the drive to Nashville. I never knew about her allergy. I swear to God. The explanation aligned with what Scott had pieced together. A desperate man making a catastrophically poor decision for what he believed were the right reasons. You could have killed her, Scott said quietly. I know that now, Robert whispered, anguish breaking through his composure. I was trying to save her, and I nearly... He couldn't finish the sentence. The interview room fell silent except for the humming fluorescent light. Scott found himself believing Robert, despite every professional instinct warning against emotional involvement. The man had committed a serious crime, but his motivation, however misguided, came from genuine concern. What happens now? Robert finally asked. "You're facing kidnapping charges, with the evidence, including the chloroform." Scott didn't need to finish. They both knew the potential sentence. "And Ellie goes into the system." Robert's shoulders slumped. "The very thing I was trying to prevent." Scott gathered his notes, unsure what he'd hoped to gain from this conversation. Confirmation, perhaps, that the situation was as complicated as it seemed, that there were no easy villains or heroes in this story, just flawed people trying to protect a child in the ways they knew how. "Officer Harrington," Robert called as Scott stood to leave. "For what it's worth, I'm glad your dog disobeyed you. He saw what none of us were seeing clearly." The statement followed Scott as he left the detention center, driving across town toward his next unscheduled stop. The parallels between Max's intuitive action and Robert's desperate choice gnawed at him. Both had broken established rules out of protective instinct, with dramatically different outcomes. Augusta Community Hospital's rehabilitation wing occupied a separate building from the main facility, a modern structure with a carefully landscaped garden visible through large windows. Scott had called ahead, unsure if Sarah Barnes would agree to see him, surprised when she'd consented immediately. He found her in a small courtyard, seated on a bench beneath a maple tree beginning to show hints of fall color. 3 days of detox had left her pale and drawn, but her eyes were clearer than at their previous meetings. "Didn't expect to see you again," Sarah said as he approached. "Unless you're here to add more charges." Scott sat beside her, leaving a respectful distance between them. "Actually, I spoke with your brother today." Sarah's expression hardened. "Bobby always did think he knew what was best for everyone. He cares about Ellie." "So do I," she snapped, then immediately deflated. "For whatever that's worth now." Scott chose his next words carefully. "I reviewed your CPS file this morning. 3 reports in the past year, all closed after initial investigation. Should I thank you for the reminder of my failures?" Bitterness edged her voice. "I also saw that you voluntarily entered outpatient treatment twice, completed parenting classes, maintained employment." Scott met her gaze directly. "That doesn't sound like someone who doesn't care." Surprise flickered across Sarah's face, followed by wary confusion. "Why are you telling me this? What do you want?" "The truth," Scott replied simply. "All of it. Not just the reports and statements, but what's really been happening with your family." For a long moment, Sarah studied him, as if weighing whether he could be trusted. Then something seemed to give way inside her. "After Mark died, I couldn't sleep. Doctor prescribed Ambien, then Xanax for the panic attacks, then Vicodin for the migraines that came from not sleeping." She twisted the memorial bracelet on her wrist. "Before I knew it, I needed them just to function. When prescriptions ran out, I found other ways to get them." The familiar trajectory of prescription addiction, Scott had seen it countless times among veterans. "I never used when Ellie was awake," Sarah continued, as if this distinction mattered deeply to her. "Only after she went to bed. I thought I was managing it. Until you weren't," Scott finished gently. She nodded, tears welling in her eyes. 2 months ago, I passed out. Ellie couldn't wake me up. She got scared, went to the neighbors. That was the first CPS report. And the others. Missing school because I couldn't get out of bed to drive her. Then the electricity got shut off because I spent the money on pills. Each admission seemed physically painful. I kept promising to do better, and I'd stay clean for a week, maybe 2. Then something would trigger me a memory of Mark, a bill I couldn't pay, and I'd be right back where I started. The cycle of addiction and recovery was painfully familiar to Scott from his work with veterans. The system tended to view it as a series of personal failures rather than a medical condition requiring comprehensive treatment. Bobby wasn't wrong, Sarah admitted, surprising Scott. I was failing her, but taking her like that. She shook her head. He could have killed her. He didn't know about her allergy, Scott said, not to excuse Robert's actions, but to provide context. Because he never bothered to ask, Sarah retorted. Just like he never asked if I wanted help, real help, not just judgment and threats to take my daughter. The siblings' fractured relationship added another layer of complexity to an already tangled situation. What do you want, Sarah? Scott asked quietly. Setting aside what's happened, what CPS is saying, what your brother did, what do you actually want? The question seemed to catch her off guard. She stared at the ground, tears dropping onto her clasped hands. I want my daughter back, she whispered. I want to be the mother she deserves. I want to get clean and stay clean. Not just for a few weeks, but for good. She looked up, a fierce determination breaking through her exhaustion. And I want a chance to prove I can do it without losing her completely in the process. Scott nodded, something crystallizing in his mind. The system was designed to protect children from unfit parents, but sometimes its rigid protocols created impossible situations, forcing choices between bad options rather than creating paths to better ones. Thank you for being honest with me, he said, standing to leave. That's it. Sarah looked confused. You came all this way just to hear me say I screwed up. No, Scott replied. I came to hear what you'd fight for, and now I know. As he walked back to his truck where Max waited patiently in his specially designed kennel, Scott's phone buzzed with a text from Chief Morgan. Board reviewed medical findings on Max's detection capabilities. You need to see this. My office. 0800 tomorrow. Another piece of the puzzle was falling into place. Scott glanced back at the rehab facility, then to Max watching him through the truck window, and finally to the hospital building where Ellie would spend her last night before entering foster care. Sometimes, like Max had demonstrated in the park, the right course of action wasn't the one outlined in any protocol or procedure. Sometimes it required seeing connections that others missed and having the courage to act on them. 1 month later, autumn had fully embraced Augusta, painting the trees in brilliant oranges and reds that lined the streets leading to Riverdale Park. Scott drove with the windows down, enjoying the crisp morning air as Max sat alertly in the specially designed back seat, his attention divided between the passing scenery and Scott's face in the rearview mirror. Almost there, buddy, Scott assured him, turning onto Park Avenue where fallen leaves danced across the pavement. So much had changed in the weeks since that fateful demonstration day. The park-ahead scene of Max's dramatic disobedience now appeared peaceful in the morning light, bearing no visible scars from the incident that had upended so many lives. Scott parked near the playground, where a small group had already gathered around a picnic table decorated with a simple blue tablecloth and a modest balloon bouquet. Chief Morgan stood chatting with Dr. Phillips, both in civilian clothes rather than their usual professional attire. Nearby, Martha Simmons arranged paper plates and napkins while keeping one eye on Ellie, who was cautiously testing the swings under the watchful gaze of a woman Scott recognized as her court-appointed supervisor. "Right on time," Chief Morgan called as Scott approached with Max at a perfect heel position. "Man of the hour arrives." Scott smiled despite his nervousness. "Wasn't sure this would come together." "You pulled off a minor miracle," Morgan replied, lowering his voice. "Don't think I've ever seen the system bend that far without breaking." The minor miracle had begun the morning after Scott's visits to Robert and Sarah. When Dr. Phillips had presented the medical findings about Max's extraordinary detection abilities to the Department Review Board, the scientific analysis had confirmed what seemed impossible. Max had detected specific chemical markers of anaphylaxis in Ellie's system before visible symptoms appeared, something no existing medical alert dog had been formally trained to do. What had started as a disciplinary review had transformed into an opportunity. With Dr. Phillips's passionate advocacy and Chief Morgan's institutional support, a proposal had rapidly taken shape, a specialized pilot program using Max's unique capabilities to train therapy dogs for children with severe medical conditions, particularly those with rare or dangerous allergies. The timing couldn't have been better. Ellie's case had become a departmental priority, with Sarah's rehabilitation progress closely monitored and Robert's legal situation growing more complicated as evidence of Sarah's neglect mounted. When Scott had proposed an alternative solution during an interdepartmental meeting with CPS, it had initially been dismissed as impossible until Chief Morgan threw his considerable influence behind it. "Officer Harrington," Ellie's voice carried across the playground as she spotted them, her face lighting up with recognition. She abandoned the swing mid-arc, landing with the fearless confidence of childhood before running toward them. Scott unclipped Max's lead, giving the command they'd practiced extensively over the past month. "Max, gentle." The shepherd moved forward at a measured pace, meeting Ellie halfway with his tail wagging happily. The child dropped to her knees, throwing her arms around Max's neck in a display of affection that would have been strictly forbidden during his regular police duty. "I missed you so much," she told the dog earnestly. "Did you miss me too?" Max responded by licking her cheek once, causing her to giggle, a sound Scott realized he hadn't heard from her until now. Martha approached, offering Scott a cup of coffee from a thermos. "She's been counting the days," she said, nodding toward her granddaughter. "Barely slept last night from excitement." "How's she adjusting?" Scott asked quietly. Martha's expression softened as she watched Ellie with Max. "Better than any of us expected. Having her own room seems to help. And the routine? Sarah calls every evening at exactly 7, hasn't missed once." The arrangement that had eventually emerged from weeks of negotiation was unorthodox, but promising Ellie would live with her grandmother in a small apartment separate from Sarah's, with Martha granted temporary guardianship while Sarah completed her rehabilitation program. Robert had accepted a plea deal involving probation and mandatory counseling rather than jail time, on the condition he worked closely with family services to repair the relationship with his sister and support her recovery rather than undermining it. Most surprisingly, the department had approved Scott's request for specialized reassignment. Max would continue his K-9 service, but with modified duties that included regular therapy sessions with Ellie and other children with similar medical conditions, under Dr. Phillips's supervision and careful documentation. "Sarah's coming today?" Scott asked, sipping the strong black coffee. Martha nodded. "Her first supervised visit outside the facility. She's earned weekend privileges 30 days clean. Pride mingled with caution in the older woman's voice. "One day at a time, like they say." As if on cue, a van with the rehabilitation center's logo pulled into the parking lot. Sarah emerged, looking remarkably different from the woman Scott had first encountered in the hospital. Though still thin, color had returned to her face, and she moved with a purposeful energy that had been absent before. Her counselor accompanied her, maintaining a respectful distance as Sarah spotted her daughter and hesitated, visibly gathering her courage. "Mommy," Ellie called, spotting her mother. She gave Max a final pat before running across the grass, her small legs carrying her as fast as they could. Sarah knelt, opening her arms to receive her daughter. Their embrace, tight and desperate on both sides, brought unexpected moisture to Scott's eyes that he quickly blinked away. "Quite a thing you've arranged here," Chief Morgan commented, joining Scott as they watched the reunion. "Unorthodox as hell, but I can't argue with the results." Scott nodded, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders as he observed the family coming together, Martha joining her daughter and granddaughter. Their 3 blonde heads bent close in conversation. It wasn't a perfect solution, and the road ahead would be challenging for all of them. But it offered something the standard procedures had not: hope. "Never thought I'd be signing off on a K-9 officer doubling as a therapy dog," Morgan continued, watching Max, who sat patiently waiting for Ellie's attention to return to him. "The brass downtown nearly had collective heart failure when I proposed it." "But they approved it," Scott reminded him, "after Dr. Phillips showed them the research potential. Turns out being the only documented case of spontaneous anaphylaxis detection makes Max pretty valuable." Morgan shook his head in wonder. Who'd have thought breaking the rules would create a whole new protocol? The irony wasn't lost on Scott. Max's act of disobedience had ultimately revealed a capability that might help countless children with severe allergies if they could successfully document and replicate his training. Sarah approached cautiously, Ellie's hand firmly clasped in hers. "Officer Harrington," she greeted him, her voice steadier than he'd ever heard it. "I wanted to thank you for everything. Max deserves the credit." Scott deflected, uncomfortable with gratitude for what had simply felt like the right thing to do. "Not just for saving Ellie that day," Sarah clarified, "for what came after. For seeing possibilities when everyone else saw problems." The simple acknowledgement touched something deep in Scott. How many times throughout his military career and police work had he followed protocol despite his instincts telling him there might be a better way? Max had shown the courage Scott had sometimes lacked the willingness to break training when a higher purpose demanded it. "Well," Martha announced, clapping her hands, "this celebration won't run itself, Melly. Want to show your mom and Officer Harrington what we brought for Max?" Ellie tugged her mother toward the picnic table where a package wrapped in newspaper sat beside a small cake decorated with a cartoonish German shepherd made of frosting. "We got him a present," Ellie explained, her voice losing some of its shyness. "Because today is special. Very special," Scott agreed, as Max followed attentively at his side. The gathering was small and simple, just the key people involved in creating this unusual arrangement, plus Dr. Phillips, who was documenting Max's interactions for her research. Yet, as Scott watched Ellie help Max unwrap a new training toy, her laughter mingling with her mother's, he felt a sense of rightness that no official commendation or recognition had ever provided. "You know," Chief Morgan said quietly, "in 30 years of law enforcement, I've seen the system fail as often as it succeeds. Too rigid, too by the book. He nodded toward Max, who was demonstrating remarkable patience as Ellie showed him how to use his new toy. Maybe we all need to trust our instincts a little more, even when they don't fit the manual. As the small celebration continued, Scott found himself reflecting on the chain of events that had brought them to this moment. Max's act of disobedience had created ripples that transformed not just Ellie's life, but Sarah's, Robert's, and his own. One decision to trust instinct over training had revealed possibilities that protocol would never have permitted. "Sometimes," Scott replied, watching as Max gently took the toy from Ellie's hand, making her laugh with delight. "The heart knows what the rule book doesn't." The autumn sun broke through gathering clouds, casting golden light across the park where their story had begun. Whatever challenges lay ahead for all of them, today marked not an ending but a new beginning, one built on second chances, hard-earned wisdom, and the simple truth that Max had demonstrated so dramatically 1 month ago: sometimes breaking the rules is the only way to do what's right. Sometimes life's most important lessons come from the most unexpected places, even from a faithful German shepherd who knew when to break the rules. In our later years, we've seen enough of life to know that systems often fail the very people they're designed to protect, that protocols can blind us to human needs, and that second chances are precious beyond measure. Scott's journey with Max reminds us of what matters most: the courage to trust our instincts when they conflict with established rules, especially when a child's welfare hangs in the balance. How many of us have stood where Scott stood, torn between duty and what our hearts knew was right? Like Sarah, we've witnessed loved ones struggle with addiction and know the long, painful road to recovery. Like Robert, we've felt the frustration when bureaucracy moves too slowly to protect the innocent. And perhaps most powerfully, like Ellie, we understand what it means to place our trust in those who prove worthy of it through actions, not words. Max's story speaks